Great to see you again, friends. I'm so glad you're here for another unforgettable moment together. Hope you're feeling good and grounded today. This time, we're diving into the story of Sarah Thompson, a retired nurse tucked away in the heart of the Blue Ridge Mountains. What she experienced last fall is almost too wild to believe, until you hear it straight from the source. Now, let's get into it. Have you ever heard a knock at your door and known in your gut it wasn't human? On the stormiest night of the year, Sarah Thompson, retired nurse, widow, and all but forgotten by the world, opened her cabin door and came face to face with a legend. Not a blurry myth on a trail cam, not a bedtime story, but real, bleeding, and looking right at her. Here's the thing no one tells you. Not everyone strange is dangerous. Some secrets only show themselves to those broken enough to see them. That creature, it didn't come to harm. It came to be saved. Sarah could slam the door, pretended it was just the wind, but she didn't. Because something in its eyes looked just like grief. And what happened next? It wasn't just a rescue. It was a ritual, a bond, a forgotten circle, older than any language. And the forest, it remembers kindness. This video tells the true story of how one woman, drowning in sorrow, became part of a secret no one would believe, and found healing in the most unexpected heart. Watch now, because if you've ever felt like you don't belong, this story might just be calling you too. The storm had passed, but the echoes of it still lingered in Sarah Thompson's chest, like the tail end of a nightmare that refused to let go. Her flannel shirt clung to her skin, damp with sweat, and the chilled breath of dawn slipping through the cracks of her old mountain cabin. A kettle hissed on the stove behind her, but her eyes were locked on the worn wooden floor, still stained with traces of mud and something darker, redder. Not a dream, not a delusion. She had seen it, touched it, cared for it, and it had looked back at her. Rewind the clock just 5 days. Before the storm, before the bleeding giant, before the impossible became real. Sarah had come to the Blue Ridge Mountains to disappear. After Mark died, after the long hospital nights, the silence of their empty house, the slow, brutal withering of a love that had outlived the man himself, she no longer wanted to be seen. So she bought this cabin with its crooked porch and rusted chimney, surrounded by miles of trees and silence, and retreated into it like a wound closing in on itself. Her days were a ritual of quiet. Morning coffee on the porch while the mist tangled itself through the pines. Slow walks through the leaf-littered trails. Journaling by firelight. It was the kind of peace that didn't ask questions. And yet, sometimes it felt like something was listening anyway. It started small. Scratches on the tree trunks near the herb garden. Stones moved from one side of the clearing to the other. A shape too tall, too still, standing between the trees just before dusk. She told herself it was a bear, or a trick of light. But the feeling, the unmistakable weight of being watched, lingered long after the forest fell silent again. Then came the storm, the kind of Appalachian tempest that cracked trees in half and screamed down the mountains like a banshee. Sarah was just blowing out her final candle when she heard it. Deep, raw, not quite animal, not quite human. A sound that twisted her stomach into a cold knot. At first she froze. But then she moved, grabbed the old lantern, shrugged into her coat and stepped into the rain. She found it near the woodshed, curled against the mud, groaning, bleeding, massive, and real. There was no guidebook for what she did next, no protocol, just instinct and something older, older than medicine, older than fear. She cleaned the wound, wrapped it, whispered words she didn't realize she remembered until they left her lips. The creature let her, not easily, but with a kind of cautious surrender, like an animal that had once known kindness and was just now remembering what it felt. By morning, it was still there, breathing, broken, trusting her. Just enough. And then the forest changed. The squirrels and deer no longer scattered when she stepped outside. They paused, watching. The birdsong shifted, strange harmonies floating through the air like warnings. The trees themselves seemed to bend differently, as though bowing towards something unseen. That second night, she heard them. Footsteps, dozens of them. Soft, rhythmic, deliberate. Not crashing through the underbrush, but gliding. Surrounding the cabin. She didn't sleep. She sat with her back against the door, heart pounding, breath shallow. But nothing came. Until dawn. And when she opened the door the next morning, what she saw would rewrite everything she thought she knew about the wild, about solitude, about where mercy leads when you choose to follow it. But none of that had happened yet. Not on that first morning when she looked down at the giant, bandaged and feverish, and whispered, "You're safe." Not when she felt, for the first time in years, not alone, and not even when she realized the wound was worse than she thought. Infected, swollen, foul-smelling, the fever rising like a tide that would drown the creature within hours if she didn't act. She had to do more than clean it now. She had to save it. Minutes later, she was on her knees beside the thing again, opening the drawer under the stairs where she kept the old army field kit, a relic from Mark's days in Vietnam. She hadn't touched it in years. Her hands shook as she pulled out gauze, antiseptic, suture thread. Then a sound behind her. On the porch, not a knock, a presence. She turned slowly and saw them. 3 dark shapes, just past the edge of the railing. Still, watching, not moving, not breathing, not human. Sarah's spine locked. Every instinct screamed, danger. But then the injured one inside the cabin let out a low, deep hum, almost a growl, almost a lullaby. And outside, the shapes bowed, not deeply, just enough to say, "We see you. We know." Then they vanished into the trees. She didn't sleep again that night either. But this time, it wasn't out of fear. It was out of awe, out of the terrifying, beautiful knowing that she had been seen by something ancient and vast, and that something had chosen to let her live. In the hours that followed, Sarah worked through the fever. The creature's body convulsed once, twice. She spoke to it in soft tones, calling it, "Fran, big guy, you stubborn miracle." Her hands moved like they remembered a rhythm older than grief, and the fever broke just before sunrise. She fell asleep on the floor next to it, curled in a blanket, her head resting on the hem of its matted fur. And when she woke, it was gone. No blood, no tracks, just the faint scent of moss and pine, and a single feather, black, long, and tipped in white, resting on the threshold. It hadn't left because it was afraid. It had left because it knew something she didn't, that this story was only beginning. The fever had broken. But the air inside the cabin was still heavy with something unnamed, something that lingered long after the crisis. Zara sat back on her heels, sweat clinging to her temples, fingers trembling as they rested on the creature's bandaged thigh. Its breathing had steadied, slow, measured, alive. But she wasn't sure if it was truly resting, or simply watching her with one eye half-lidded, feigning sleep while measuring her soul. The fire in the hearth crackled gently. Outside, the world was a dripping silence, every leaf coated in storm water, every branch sagging low as if mourning. Inside, it was no less solemn. She should have been exhausted. She should have collapsed from the adrenaline drain alone. But something in her spine held taut, a thread of tension that refused to relax. Maybe it was instinct. Maybe it was memory. Maybe it was the fact that, despite the sheer unlikelihood of everything that had happened in the last 48 hours, she felt, for the first time in years, deeply and terribly awake. Later, she made a weak tea from yarrow and honey and offered it in a chipped ceramic bowl, placing it carefully beside the creature's face. It didn't drink, but it looked at her. not with the vacant gaze of an animal, with comprehension, hesitation. Then the faintest nod. Barely more than a breath of motion. She felt the tremor of that acknowledgement ripple through her chest, like the first time Mark had squeezed her hand after surgery, when they still believed he might make it through. By noon, she had pulled her rocking chair closer to the hearth, wrapped herself in a quilt, and watched the creature sleep, or pretend to. The firelight licked across its fur in golden waves. The bandage around its thigh was already darkening. She would need to rewrap it tonight, maybe sooner. But just as she reached for the first aid kit again, she noticed something odd. The wind outside had stopped entirely. No birdsong, no creak of branches, the kind of silence that wasn't peaceful, but expectant. She froze. A few seconds later, there was a soft, deliberate thump on the porch. Not heavy, not clumsy. Intentional. She stood, one hand on the lantern, the other hovering near the doorframe. A second thump, then stillness. She stepped toward the door, and that's when the knock came. Not a bang, not a fist, just a single flat-palmed knock. She opened the door and saw no one, just wet earth and the receding mist. But there, at the foot of the porch, was a small object. A twist of cedar bark, intricately braided. It wasn't there this morning. She picked it up. It was warm. Back inside, the creature was watching her again. Not with fear, with recognition. Something inside her shifted. She didn't understand what was happening, but she knew, deep in her bones, that the creature hadn't come alone, that this wasn't just a lost being seeking shelter. It was part of something bigger, something ancient, and now she had touched it, stepped across the boundary, knowingly or not. For the rest of the day, Sarah moved quietly through her routines, but the shape of her thoughts had changed. The trees outside no longer seemed passive. The forest itself had begun to feel like a presence, like a cathedral with no god, only the hush of sacred things watching from the rafters. That night, while tending the wound again, she spoke aloud for the first time in hours. "I don't know if you understand me," she said softly, "but I think you're not the only one watching." The creature blinked once, deliberate. Then, just before sleep came, she heard them again, footsteps, many, from all sides of the cabin. They didn't approach, didn't break the tree line, just circled, moved, waited. And then, a new sound, a low, melodic hum that rose from the dark like the sound of wind through hollow bone. It pulsed gently, not threatening, but deep enough to vibrate the glass panes in the windows. The creature stirred, groaned, reached weakly toward the door. Sarah opened it. Nothing moved, but the cedar trees nearest the porch were swaying, though there was no wind. That night she didn't sleep in her bed. She laid a blanket beside the creature, next to the fire, and slept on the floor. When she woke, the braided cedar bark had been placed at the foot of her blanket. Next to it, a single raven's feather, dark, gleaming, unnatural in its symmetry. And her rocking chair had been turned to face the forest. She stepped onto the porch. There were footprints. Not just one set. Many. Huge. Bare. Pressed into the mud like shadows etched into earth. The forest had come close, and it had chosen, for now, not to take her. She looked back into the cabin. The creature's eyes were closed, but it was smiling. The kind of smile that said, they know, and they're waiting. So Sarah did the only thing that made sense. She waited too. The next morning broke without ceremony. The sky held its breath behind a thin veil of clouds, and the forest stood still, cloaked in the scent of pine, damp soil, and something older than either. Sarah stood on the porch, the braided cedar still in her hand, fingers brushing its surface like she could read something hidden in its twist. Behind her, the creature, now less a stranger and more a strange companion, shifted with a quiet grunt of pain but didn't rise. It had slept through the night. So had she. Not deeply. Not peacefully. But enough. She boiled more water, made a second batch of herbal salve, and whispered as she worked. Not to herself. Not exactly. The creature didn't respond, but the stillness between them had changed. It wasn't the strained, uncertain silence of survival anymore. It was attentive, listening. When she knelt beside its wound again, it didn't flinch. Its massive hand, fingers thick as rolling pins, lay near hers on the blanket. Neither of them moved it. For a moment, she thought of Mark, his hands after the stroke. How she'd held them, even when they stopped holding her back. I used to think silence was a kind of mercy, she murmured, dabbing at the edges of the bandage. But it's not. Not really. It's just a space where everything else gets louder. The creature blinked, slow, deliberate. She took it as an answer. By mid-afternoon, she'd moved a small table near the front door, placed a pitcher of water and a bowl of apples on it, offering, habit, or something in between. The forest still felt too quiet, like it was waiting. She scanned the trees again. Nothing. No movement. No watchers. Until the apple disappeared. She hadn't seen it vanish. 1 minute it was there. The next, gone. The pitcher remained, no sound. No footsteps. She stepped back inside, closed the door, and locked it. For the rest of the day, she kept herself busy, re-sterilizing the instruments, washing the linens, boiling more tea. Every few hours, she'd check the creature's pulse, monitor the swelling. It remained lucid, alert. But it hadn't tried to leave, not once. As night fell, she lit every lantern in the cabin. Not because she was afraid, she told herself that over and over. Not because she was afraid, but because darkness now felt like a shared space. The moment came after midnight. She was sitting in the rocker, half dozing, when the creature suddenly sat up, not with a groan or a grimace, like it had been called. It turned its head toward the window. So did she. A soft glow flickered between the trees. She rose, walked to the door. Didn't open it yet. Listened. And then, moistened. No. Melah style. The creature rose slowly, leaning on the doorframe for balance. She stepped aside without speaking. It opened the door. The forest beyond was lit with fireflies. Except they didn't move like insects. They held formation. Dozens of small golden orbs hovered between the trees, swaying slowly, as if breathing. And between them, shapes. Tall. Still. Watching. She didn't step forward. She didn't need to. One of the figures emerged. Not close, just enough for the firelight to catch the curve of its shoulder, the gleam of its eye. Then, it placed something on the ground. A curved piece of antler, etched with symbols, darkened at the tip with what looked like charcoal. And just as silently as it had come, the figure stepped back. She turned to the creature beside her. It nodded. Then, using both arms for support, it stepped off the porch and walked, limping, slow, toward the trees, toward them. But it didn't vanish. It turned back, lifted one hand, and pointed at her. Not a gesture of farewell. A beckoning. The message was clear. Follow. Her breath caught in her throat. She didn't move. Not yet. But every part of her burned with the knowing that she would. She couldn't stay in the cabin anymore. Not just because the forest had changed, but because she had. When she stepped outside the next morning, the antler was still there, and so was the feather. And this time, a third gift, laid neatly in the crook of the porch rail. A stone. Smooth. Obsidian black. Warm to the touch. She closed her fingers around it. And for the first time in years, she didn't feel cold. She didn't know where they had gone. But she knew They hadn't gone far. She knew she was being led. And she knew, without question, that whatever was coming next would not be just for the creature's healing. It would be for hers. The fourth night began with a silence that wasn't just quiet. It was waiting. The kind of hush that presses into your skin and that makes every step sound louder than it should. Sarah stood barefoot on the edge of her porch, the obsidian stone warm in her palm, the air cool against her face. The cabin behind her was dark, untouched. The clearing before her breathed softly in the dusk light, and somewhere past the tree line, beyond the curtain of pine and shadow, they were watching again. But not just watching, they were inviting. She stepped off the porch. The ground felt different, not softer, not wetter, just charged, like stepping into a memory you didn't know you had. She walked slow, measured. With each step, the trees seemed to tilt subtly toward her. Not moving, not exactly, but leaning, aware. It wasn't long before she saw them. First just silhouettes, tall, motionless, spaced wide enough that each could vanish behind a single tree if they chose. But they didn't vanish. They stood, just far enough that she couldn't make out their faces, but close enough to feel their presence in her spine. She didn't run. She didn't speak. She just waited. And one of them moved, not forward, just shift, like someone stepping aside to let her pass. She understood. Her feet carried her into the woods, the figures repositioning with the grace of animals, always flanking her but never blocking. She felt oddly safe, watched, yes, but not hunted, protected, guided. The deeper she walked, the more the forest changed, not visually, atmospherically. The air grew cooler, but not cold. The wind brushed against her like breath. And then she heard it again. That humming. Faint, low, from all directions at once. It took her to a clearing, smaller than she expected. No fire, no stone circle, just earth. Soft, damp, and one figure kneeling in its center, the creature she had cared for. Still bandaged, still limping, but upright, alive. It turned toward her. Then, without a word, it knelt lower and pressed its palm flat against the ground. That's when the others emerged fully, from the trees, from the shadows. Dozens of them. Silhouettes became beings. Beings became a circle. They stood at the edges of the clearing, unmoving, forming a perfect perimeter. A wall of silence and breath and fur and depth. Sarah's knees buckled, but she didn't fall. Her chest ached with something she couldn't name. And then, one stepped forward. White fur, taller than the rest, broad across the shoulders, but with a presence so calm, so solemn, that it silenced the night further. Not a leader by declaration, but by the weight of stillness alone. It raised one hand. Open. Slow. Sarah mirrored the motion. Not knowing why, just knowing it mattered. Then it came to her, not running, not reaching, just walking, like time itself had stepped out of the woods to stand before her. It held out an object, small, wooden, carved, a bird. Not just any bird, an owl, wings folded, head turned slightly, eyes closed. She took it. Her fingers closed around the carving like it was something she'd lost long ago. Like it belonged to her before she ever knew this place, these beings, this story. That's when the circle began to move. Not a dance, not a ceremony. A motion. Each creature touched the earth, rose, then stepped to the side, allowing the next to do the same. It was slow, intentional, reverent, as if marking her. As if drawing a boundary around what she had done, who she had become. And when it ended, they stood again, silent. The white-furred one stepped forward once more, and it spoke, not in words, not with sound. With its eyes, And in that moment, Sarah understood something she couldn't explain. She wasn't here by accident. They had known her before she knew herself. She had not saved the creature. She had answered a call. And they were here now to answer back. Tears spilled, not from fear, not from joy, just from the weight of understanding. Then, one by one, the figures began to fade back into the trees. Not rushing, not hiding, just retreating, leaving the clearing, leaving her. Except for the injured one. It stepped to her side and walked with her back through the woods. The stars above them blinked through the canopy. And for the first time since Mark died, Sarah did not feel small under them. She felt held. When they reached the cabin again, she turned to the creature. But it was already gone. No sound, no motion. Just the owl in her hand, and the knowing in her heart that this night would echo for the rest of her life, that this story was no longer hers alone, that the forest had a voice, and it had spoken her name. The sky that morning was a pale, breathless canvas, as if the world itself had exhaled after the previous night. Sarah awoke sitting upright in her chair, the carved owl still cradled in her hands like a living thing. Her joints ached. Her neck felt stiff from sleep that hadn't reached the deepest parts of her brain. And yet, there was no fog in her mind, no sense of heaviness. Only a clarity she hadn't known she was missing. The fireplace had long since gone cold, but she felt warm. Not physically, from the inside. A warmth that hadn't been sparked by fire, but by knowing, by being seen. She stepped outside and immediately knew the forest had changed again. The clearing felt touched, reverent. Even the birds, usually tentative in the early hours, seemed to sing with a gentler cadence. There were new tracks near the steps, small, carefully placed, not from the injured creature. These were from others, younger, lighter. And then she saw them, gifts, laid neatly on the porch rail like offerings at a shrine. A bundle of twine-tied moss, still damp and sweet-smelling. A handful of river-polished stones arranged in a circle like miniature sentinels. And nestled between them, a feather, red and gold, phoenix-like. From a bird she didn't know, from a place she'd never been. She gathered them without speaking, carried them inside, laid them gently beside the owl carving and the obsidian stone on her mantel. Not trophies, not tokens. Something more sacred. The rest of the morning passed with a strange rhythm. She made breakfast, but barely touched it, brewed tea, and forgot its steeping. Her hands moved through routines, but her mind wandered to the woods, to the clearing, to the circle that had stood like stone and shadow beneath the moonlight. By late afternoon, the wind shifted again. This time, it didn't whisper. It carried a sound with it, low, rhythmic, a heartbeat not from any chest, but from the trees themselves. It was calling again, not urgently, but with intent. She didn't hesitate. Wrapped herself in a wool coat, tied her hair back like she used to during emergency shifts at the hospital. Ready, calm, focused, she stepped off the porch and into the trees, the path forming naturally before her like the woods remembered her weight. The sun slanted lower as she walked, and just as the golden light turned amber, she saw them again. Not all at once. 1, then 2, then 10. Lining the trail like guardians, still, watching, respectful. She kept walking. At the edge of another clearing, smaller than before, she saw movement. A young one, not more than 4 feet tall, thin, gangly. Its fur lighter than the others she'd seen, almost a sandy brown. It was crouched beside something, a sapling, broken at the base, struggling to hold itself upright. The young creature was humming, low, vibrational, the same tune she'd heard in the dark. But now she could feel it against her bones. She approached slowly. The child, Because that's what it was, unmistakably. Didn't run. It looked up, eyes wide, then looked back down at the sapling. Its hand rested over the crack in the bark, as if trying to hold it together. Sarah knelt beside it, wordless, reached out and gently placed her hand atop the child's. The humming paused, and then from behind them, a sound broke the quiet, a rustle, a crack, a thud. She stood immediately, shielding the young one instinctively. Across the clearing, two larger figures emerged, not the kind she'd grown used to. Their postures were tighter, shoulders hunched, movements sharp. They looked at her, not with hostility, but with something like scrutiny, uncertain, assessing. She held her ground, but the young one stepped from behind her, walked straight toward them, and placed its tiny hand in Sarah's. That moment shifted everything. The two larger figures relaxed, their heads lowered slightly. One touched its own chest, then the ground. Then Sarah. It wasn't language, it was acknowledgement, and that's when she realized this was no accident. This was a presentation. She hadn't just been invited into a ceremony, she was part of it. The child had chosen her, and the others had come to witness. The clearing filled slowly, figures stepping from trees, silent, intent, no movement wasted. Every breath felt purposeful. A hush fell that didn't feel quiet. It felt full. Then, from the shadows, the white-furred elder returned. It didn't step into the center. It stood at the edge and bowed. No grand gesture, no flourish, just reverence. And every other being followed, even the young one beside her, until she was the only one standing. She dropped to one knee, not from custom, not from imitation, from instinct, from humility. And as she did, the entire circle stood again, together, and began to hum. Not a song, a signal, a remembering. It didn't vibrate her bones. It reached something deeper. Memories that weren't hers flooded her. Markings on cave walls, firelight dancing over hands raised in welcome, old forest paths remembered only by the roots themselves. She felt it all. And when the hum stopped, they stepped back, not dismissing her, freeing her, allowing her to carry it. When she returned to the cabin, the sun was gone. The stars were out, but they weren't distant anymore. They felt as close as the moss beneath her feet, and on the porch sat a new carving. This time, a hand, human, outstretched, and resting in its palm, an acorn, still green, still alive. She took it inside, and the hum followed her. By the time Sarah returned from the clearing that evening, her hand still cradling the carved hand and the live acorn, the cabin no longer felt like just her home. It felt like part of something wider, breathing, ancient. The door creaked open not from age, but as if it had waited. The air inside held the faintest trace of cedar smoke, though she hadn't lit a fire. As though someone, or something, had kept watch. She placed the acorn gently in the hollow of a clay bowl on the mantel, nestled beside the owl, the obsidian stone, and the braided cedar. It fit perfectly, as if it belonged there. And then she sat, staring at them all, heart thudding not with fear, but with purpose. Whatever this was, she was now undeniably within it. She slept uneasily that night, not from nightmares, from anticipation. And in the hour just before dawn, something woke her. A sound. Soft. Familiar. Like something tapping on wood, once, then again. She rose slowly, barefoot, walked to the front door, and opened it without hesitation. In the faint blue-gray morning, 3 small figures stood at the edge of the clearing, younger ones. One she recognized, the child from the sapling. They held nothing in their hands. Just stood there, waiting. Sarah didn't speak. She nodded once and stepped off the porch. They led her through a new path this time, deeper, colder, The terrain shifted underfoot, roots thicker, the air heavier with moss and mist. She felt as if she were descending, not downward but inward, toward the heart of something hidden. Eventually, the trees opened, not into a clearing, into a structure, or the remains of one. Massive stones arranged in circles, overgrown with ivy and vines, but still sharp-edged in ways nature couldn't create. It was a place built, not by man, but by intention. In the center, resting atop a flat stone slab, was the injured one. The first one, the one she'd saved, now fully upright, stronger. Bandages removed, scars healing. And beside it, the white-furred elder, both silent. Sarah stepped forward without instruction, and as she approached, something changed. The very air shifted. It thickened. The forest around her pulsed, not visibly, not audibly, but rhythmically. A low vibration in her feet, in her ribs. The way music feels when it has no melody, only truth. Then came the circle. They emerged from the trees, not all at once, but in sequence, like stars appearing one by one at twilight. They formed a perimeter again, not out of defense, but solidarity. Dozens, maybe more. Then, the humming began. But this time, Sarah joined them. Not with her voice, but with her breath. She didn't know how she knew, but she did. She stepped up to the slab, where the injured one now stood. It reached out and placed something into her hand. Another carving. But not a creature, not a symbol, a cabin. Hers, detailed. Exact. Down to the porch rail and the split in the back step. She looked up, eyes wide. It placed its palm over its chest, then over hers, then pointed back the way they came. Understanding slammed into her like thunder through fog. This was not a farewell. This was an anointing. She had not just been accepted. She had been given a role, a place. The injured one turned, walked to the center of the ring, and raised both arms. And in response, the others moved in. Closer, closer, until she was surrounded by breathing giants, all watching her, not with awe, but with recognition. And then, from the rush of memory, not hers, moving through her like wind through dry leaves, fires, storms, lives lost, lives lost, lives saved. She saw children, death, renewal. Each vision blinding and wordless, yet seared into... Then it was gone. They parted. She stepped back and understood. She was no longer a visitor to their world. She was its guardian. That night, as she returned to her cabin, the wind carried the hum all the way back to her doorstep, and she hummed with it. When she crossed the threshold, a new gift waited. This time, not carved, painted, an image of her. Standing with the young one, in the middle of the circle, her hand raised, and behind her, the cabin, lit, alive, alive. She placed it above the hearth, next to the acorn. And as she did, the lights flickered, not from power, from presence. She was not alone. She would never be alone again. And whatever was coming, whatever she had been marked for, she would meet it not with fear, but with fire. The days that followed bent time in strange ways. Sometimes Sarah would glance at the clock and swear hours had passed in the space of minutes. Other times, she'd find herself sitting at the edge of her porch, sunlight bleeding over the trees, and realize dusk had arrived without warning. The cabin, once just a shell to disappear into, now felt like a living pulse beneath her skin, each beam and nail humming with something older than memory. Her sleep deepened, her breath slowed, And even in the quietest moments, she felt surrounded. The owl carving remained on the mantel, its wooden feathers now darkened slightly, as if absorbing time. The acorn had not shriveled or dried. It had split, just slightly. Its green shell cracked open, revealing a pale root pressing toward the earth. She left it untouched. Some things, she knew now, were not hers to interrupt. One evening, she heard the song again, but this time, it was coming from the north. She'd never been that way, not far. The trees were denser, the paths muddier, but the sound, gentle, echoing through the canopy, was unmistakable. A call, not urgent, but undeniable. So she packed a bag, not much, a thermos, a blanket, a pocket knife she hadn't touched since Mark. The carved hand went with her too, not out of superstition but trust. She left at dusk. The trail wound tightly, branches low enough to brush her shoulders, roots curling like sleeping serpents under her boots. Every so often she'd see it, a flicker of movement, a glint of fur, the glimmer of familiar eyes watching from just out of reach. And they were not alone. At some point, she didn't know when, she passed through something. Not a doorway, a shift. The air thickened again, gravity bent. And suddenly she was standing at the mouth of a canyon she hadn't known existed. In its center, fire. Not bonfire, not destruction, a flame suspended midair. No wood, no smoke, just a single column of fire, flickering upward as though rising from the earth's breath. Around it the elders stood, not moving, not speaking. And across from her, the injured one, whole now, radiant, alive. She stepped forward, and something inside her chest cracked, not painfully, but completely. It was the kind of ache she hadn't allowed herself since the machine stopped beeping in Mark's hospital room, since the last time she held his hand, and knew it would never squeeze back. The grief had lived in her like a second shadow. Silent. Constant. Until now. The fire pulsed once, then again, and then a shape stepped through it. At first, she thought it was another elder. Then it moved. Smoother. Slower. Like fog poured into bone. And Sarah realized this wasn't Bigfoot. It was an animal. It was something else. Its body was tall, slender, wrapped in what looked like bark and light. Its face changed constantly, from beast to bird, to woman to stone and back again. And it carried something. She saw it as it was placed into her hands. A bundle of cloth, warm, soft, alive. And then she understood. She wasn't just a guardian. She was a vessel. The cloth stirred. Tiny fingers stretched into the air, grasping nothing, but full of potential. A child, not human, not entirely, but part of her now. The others bowed. One by one. And she didn't kneel this time. She stood, cradling the future in her arms. The air around her swirled gently, almost playfully, and from the trees behind the elders, the younger ones appeared, laughing, not audibly, but with motion, with movement, with presence. The canyon pulsed with joy. But joy wasn't the end. The wind shifted again, colder, sharper. Or a promise. She looked at the white-furred elder. It raised a hand and pointed toward the horizon, toward the mountains far beyond the trees. She would have to go. Not yet. But soon. For now, she returned to the cabin, the stars brighter than ever, the wind at her back, and in her arms the child cooed once, a sound like moss breaking through stone, the sound of something beginning. The child slept curled against Sarah's chest, no heavier than a loaf of bread, but pulsing with a presence that felt older than time. Its breath was soft, steady, a rhythm that didn't match her own but merged with it anyway, like a second heartbeat beneath her ribs. She sat in the old rocking chair on the porch, wrapped in a quilt Mark's mother had made decades ago, eyes fixed on the tree line. The forest no longer looked like something separate. It looked like a memory, waiting. She rocked slow, one creak at a time. Behind her, the cabin glowed with the amber flicker of lantern light, but she didn't need it. The moon was full, high, and impossibly bright, casting silver across the clearing in long, fluid strokes. The trees didn't just move in the wind. They swayed like they were breathing. There hadn't been a word spoken since the fire in the canyon. Not a gesture since the elders' nod toward the mountains. But she knew what it meant. That this chapter was almost over. That another would come. That she wouldn't be staying in this cabin forever. But not tonight. Tonight, something else was stirring. She felt it before she heard it. The stillness in the animals. The sudden absence of the breeze. Then the sound. Not footsteps. A hum. Familiar. Stronger now. Layered. She stood, child still sleeping against her, and stepped to the edge of the porch. Her eyes scanned the clearing. Then, movement. Dozens. Figures. Tall and silent, emerging one by one from between the trees. The elders. The young ones. Even the ones she hadn't seen since the early nights. Those who had only watched from the dark. They came closer. Not threatening. Not even solemn. Just present. And then at the center stepped the one she had saved. Fully healed now. Massive. Regal. Eyes deep with gratitude and something more. Reverence. It carried something. A bundle. Wrapped in the same kind of bark and moss the child had been. But this was no child. It was a gift. When it reached her, it held it out. She looked down. Inside, symbols. Scrawled onto stone. Carved into wood. Painted across tanned hide. Stories. Of her. Of the cabin. Of the child now sleeping in her arms. Of what she had done. And what she had become. Guardian. Witness. Midwife to the bridge between worlds. Tears pricked her eyes. Not from sorrow. Not from joy. From recognition. And then from behind the elder, the white-furred one appeared once more. It moved slowly, but with purpose, holding in its hand something small and dark and round. A seed. Not an acorn. Larger. Thicker, coated in something that shimmered faintly under moonlight. It placed it in her free hand. She didn't ask what it was. She didn't need to. It was her next calling. A planting of something new. Something that would only grow where magic had touched earth. And then, without a sound, the others began to gather in a wide circle around her. A wide open ring of fur and breath and presence. They didn't move. They didn't speak. They bowed, all of them, to her, and to the child, and to the story now rooted between them. She bowed back, knees trembling, and when she rose, the wind picked up again. This time warm, scented with pine and moss and fire. The elder stepped back, and the circle opened. The clearing emptied, slowly, reverently, until she was alone again. But not really. She never would be again. A few moments later, as she rocked gently with the child once more, something shifted in the forest. A shadow moved, slowly. Then another. She squinted and smiled. For standing just beyond the tree line were two deer, heads raised high, ears alert. And beside them, something taller, something broader, something broader. The silhouette of a figure that was not entirely beast, not entirely human. Watching, protecting, honoring. Sarah looked down at the child in her arms, then back at the forest. Oh, go on, she whispered. We're not done yet. The tree stirred once more. And from deep within them, just for a breath of a second, came the sound of a voice she hadn't heard in years. Mark's. Not a word, just the exhale of peace. And Sarah knew the story she'd become part of wasn't meant to be believed. It was meant to be felt, lived, passed down. Not through books, but through presence, through kindness, through silence. She leaned back in the chair, and as dawn crept over the ridge and spilled light across the porch, the child stirred again. Eyes opened, and in them reflected not just her own face, but a world waiting to be seen. In the quiet corners of the world, far from the noise of cities and the hum of modern life, there are stories that don't need to be told to be true. Stories that live in the hush between trees, in the footprints left where no road exists, in the hearts of those who dared to open their doors to the unknown. These stories are not made of fame or proof, but of presence, of what happens when we choose compassion over fear, silence over judgment, and connection over control. Because sometimes the things we are most afraid of are not here to harm us. Sometimes they are simply waiting for someone to see them, to listen, to care. And when we do, something ancient awakens, not just in the woods, but in ourselves. A remembering of how deeply we belong to something bigger, something breathing and wild and wise. This is what it means to be human, not to dominate nature, but to witness it, to stand on the edge of mystery and not demand answers, but offer reverence. And in return, be changed by the encounter. Be softened. Be opened. Be healed. There are places on this earth that hold more truth in a shadow than any book, more wisdom in a single gesture than all our words combined. And when we come close, really close, we begin to understand. The world is not waiting to be conquered. It is waiting to be honored. So wherever you are, however you came to this story, let it be a reminder. That halloon does not always roar. That love can look like tending something no one else can see. That the most extraordinary moments often come wrapped in quiet, and that the wild, whether in a forest or a heart, will always find its way home to those who dare to listen. Thank you for walking through this journey with us. If this story touched you, if it stirred something real and rooted deep within, we invite you to leave your thoughts below. Share what you felt, what you remembered, what you now see differently. And if you want to hear more stories like this, ones that hum softly but echo long, don't forget to follow, subscribe, and stay with us. There are still so many paths to walk, and some of them begin with a single step into the unknown.